Sometimes a man can live his whole life believing he's meant to be alone, until one moment changes everything. In the harsh Colorado mountains of 1847, Silas Grizzly McGraw had spent 15 years running from civilization and his own painful past. The mountain man survived by hunting wolves and avoiding all human contact. His fearsome reputation kept strangers away from his remote cabin. But when he found a young woman hanging upside down from a tree, left to die by ruthless outlaws, something stirred inside him that he thought was long dead. The woman was barely alive, her hands bound tight, blood rushing to her head. Most folks knew Grizzly as a man who showed no mercy to anyone. What would this hardened loner do when faced with someone who desperately needed saving? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The worn leather handle of Grizzly's hunting knife felt familiar in his calloused palm as he approached the hanging figure. 15 winters in these mountains had taught him to move silent as morning mist, but his heart hammered against his ribs like it hadn't done since the war. The young woman's auburn hair cascaded toward the frozen ground, her face flushed crimson from the blood pooling in her skull. Her wrists, bound with coarse rope, had been rubbed raw from struggling. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice rusty from months of silence. With one swift motion, he severed the rope above her ankles. She collapsed into his arms, dead weight and frighteningly cold. Her breathing came in shallow, desperate gasps. Grizzly carried her to his cabin, a sturdy log structure he'd built into the mountainside with his own hands. The interior was sparse but clean, a stone fireplace, handmade furniture, shelves lined with preserved meat and supplies. He laid her gently on his own bed, the only soft surface in the place, and stoked the fire until flames danced high and warm. As he tended to her injuries with practiced efficiency, memories he'd kept buried surfaced unbidden. Another woman, another. Time when his healing hands hadn't been enough. Sarah's face appeared in his mind's eye, his wife's gentle smile, the way she'd hum while cooking, how she'd reached for him even as the fever took her. Their daughter Emma, barely walking, following so soon after. He pushed the ghosts away and focused on the present. This woman was alive. This time, perhaps, his help would matter. For 3 days she drifted between sleep and delirium, while he maintained his vigil. He spooned broth between her cracked lips, changed cold compresses on her forehead, and listened to her fevered mumblings about wagons and screaming horses. When her eyes finally opened on the 4th morning, they were the color of prairie sky. After a storm, blue-gray and searching, she startled at the sight of him, scrambling backward until her spine pressed against the log wall. Her gaze darted frantically around the cabin, taking in the animal pelts, the arsenal of weapons, his own intimidating bulk silhouetted against the firelight. "Peace," he said, raising both hands. "You're safe here. Who are you?" Her voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from screaming she couldn't remember. "Name's McGraw. Folks call me Grizzly." He kept his distance, settling into a chair he'd pulled near the bed days earlier. "Found you strung up like a side of beef 3 miles south of here." She touched her throat reflexively, wincing at the tender bruises. "I remember." Her eyes widened with sudden terror. "The outlaws. They killed everyone. The whole wagon train. That was 6 days past. You've been fevering something fierce." Slowly, carefully, she examined her surroundings with more attention. The cabin was rough but scrupulously maintained. Shelves lined the walls, holding everything from medical supplies to books, more books than she'd expected a mountain hermit to own. A chess set sat on a small table, the pieces carved from antler and dark wood. The man himself, despite his fearsome nickname and appearance, had tended her with obvious skill and gentleness. "My name is Clara," she said finally. "Clara Whitmore." She paused, studying his weathered face. "You saved my life." Grizzly nodded once, uncomfortable with gratitude. "Found this tangled in your dress." He produced a silver locket, its chain broken. "Figured it might mean something." Clara's fingers trembled as she accepted the piece. Inside, a tiny daguerreotype showed a middle-aged couple, her parents, taken before the consumption claimed them both. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching it to her chest. "You mentioned a wagon train. Where were you headed?" "Denver. I was traveling with the Patterson expedition. 23 wagons, families mostly, some single men seeking gold." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke. "We'd been on the trail for 2 months. I was hired as a teacher, planning to establish a school once we reached the city." "What happened?" Clara closed her eyes, remembering. "They came at dawn, while most folks were still sleeping. Maybe 15 men, all armed and whooping like savages. They killed the guards first, then anyone who tried to fight. The leader, a big man with a black beard, he gave orders to take what they could carry and burn the rest. You see this leader?" "Clear? Clear enough." He had a scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, cold eyes, like chips of winter ice. The men called him Blackjack. Grizzly's expression darkened. He'd heard that name whispered in trading posts and settlements. Blackjack Crane and his gang had been terrorizing the territory for 3 years, leaving a trail of burned homesteads and unmarked graves. "Why string you up instead of—" He couldn't finish the thought. "I was teaching the children their letters when the attack started. Hid them in a root cellar beneath the Morrison wagon. Told them to stay quiet no matter what. They heard." Clara's voice broke slightly. "When the outlaws found me, I wouldn't tell them where the children were hidden. So they decided to make an example. Said they'd let me think about my choices while the blood rushed to my head. The children, I pray they stayed hidden until help came." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Or until they were brave enough to make their way to the nearest settlement." Grizzly stood and moved to the window, peering out at the late afternoon sky. Snow had begun falling again, heavy flakes that would make travel difficult, but something else troubled him more than the weather. "Miss Whitmore, I need you to understand something. This territory doesn't see many travelers this late in the season. No rescue parties, no cavalry patrols. If those outlaws are still in the area, they're looking for me." Clara finished his thought, her face pale but resolute. "Because I can identify them. I'm a witness to their crimes, most likely." She absorbed this information with more courage than he'd expected. "Then what do you suggest, Mr. McGraw?" He turned back to face her, seeing something in her steady gaze that reminded him of Sarah's quiet strength. "You get well, and come spring, I'll guide you to Denver myself. These mountains are my territory. I know every pass, every cave, every trail. We can wait them out. And if they find us first—" Grizzly's hand moved instinctively to the Colt revolver at his hip, then to the rifle mounted above the fireplace. Both weapons were cleaned and loaded, a habit that had kept him alive. "Through 2 wars and 15 years of wilderness living. Then they'll learn why the Ute call these peaks the realm of the Grizzly spirit." His voice carried the quiet certainty of a man who'd faced death many times and emerged victorious. "I didn't survive Antietam and the Montana Territory just to let a pack of murdering cowards harm an innocent woman under my protection." Clara felt something shift inside her chest, not just relief, but a warmth she hadn't experienced since her parents' death. This gruff, intimidating man was offering her more than shelter. He was offering hope. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why would you risk yourself for a stranger?" Grizzly was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of old grief and perhaps the first stirring of redemption. "Because sometimes, Miss Whitmore, helping one person is the only way a man can forgive himself for all the ones he couldn't help." Outside, the wind began to howl through the peaks, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of horses' hooves echoed against stone. Grizzly moved to the window with the fluid motion of a predator, his weathered fingers easing the curtain aside just enough to peer into the gathering dusk. Clara watched him transform from gentle caretaker to something altogether more dangerous. The change was subtle but unmistakable. The set of his shoulders, the way his breathing slowed, the deadly stillness that settled over him like a second skin. How many? She whispered. 3 riders, moving slow, studying the ground. His voice had dropped to barely above a breath. They're tracking. Clara's blood turned to ice water. Despite the warmth from the fireplace, she found herself shivering. Are they quiet now? Grizzly moved away from the window, gathering his rifle and checking the loads in his revolver with practiced efficiency. Could be anyone. Trappers, prospectors, even cavalry scouts, but we don't take chances. He crossed to a wooden chest beneath his bed and withdrew a crumpled piece of paper. The wanted poster had seen better days. The ink was faded, the edges torn from being passed hand to hand through every settlement and trading post in the territory. But the crude drawing was clear enough. A bearded man with cruel eyes and a distinctive scar running from ear to mouth. Blackjack Crane, Clara breathed, recognizing the face that would haunt her nightmares. $5,000 reward, dead or alive. 5,000's a fortune out here, enough to tempt good men to foolish acts. Grizzly folded the poster and tucked it back into the chest. But this gang's been operating for 3 years. They know these mountains almost as well as I do. The hoofbeats had stopped. Clara strained her ears but heard only the wind and the crackling of the fire. The silence felt more ominous than the sound of approaching horses. What do? We wait. And if waiting doesn't work, Grizzly checked his rifle one more time, we remind them why most folks avoid Grizzly McGraw's territory. Minutes passed, like hours. Clara found herself thinking about the children from the wagon train, wondering if they'd escaped, if they'd found safety. The Morrison family had been kind to her during the long journey west. Little Amy Morrison, barely 6 years old, had been Clara's most eager student, always raising her hand to spell words or recite poems. A soft knock at the door shattered the silence. Grizzly's eyes met Clara's, and she saw her own fear reflected there. Nobody knocked on doors in the wilderness. Visitors either announced themselves loudly or came shooting. Grizzly McGraw. The voice was rough, weather-beaten. We know you're in there, we ain't looking for trouble. Then ride on, Grizzly called back, positioning himself beside the door with his rifle ready. This is private land. We got business with you, about the woman. Clara's heart hammered so hard she was certain the men outside could hear it. Grizzly glanced at her, then moved to the window again. In the fading light, he could make out 3 figures on horseback, but something bothered him about their positioning. Professional gunmen would have surrounded the cabin by now. What woman? He called out. The one from the wagon train massacre. Pretty little thing with red hair. We know she's in there. Don't know what you're talking about. A different voice spoke up, younger and nervous. Look, McGraw, we ain't part of Crane's gang. We're bounty hunters. There's word going around that someone survived the Patterson expedition attack. If she can identify the killers, that information's worth good money to the territorial governor. Clara moved closer to Grizzly, her voice barely audible. Could they be telling the truth? Bounty hunters are like wolves, he murmured back. Sometimes. They hunt alone, sometimes in packs, but they're always hungry. He raised his voice again. Show me some identification. Slide it under the door. We ain't got papers, but we got this. Something metallic clinked against the wooden door, then fell to the floor with a soft thud. Grizzly waited a full minute before approaching it. A deputy's badge, tarnished silver with Territorial Marshal Service engraved around a 5-pointed star. It looked authentic, but badges could be stolen or purchased from corrupt officials. Where'd you get this? Grizzly demanded. Marshal Hayes in Denver gave it to me personal. Name's Tom Brennan. These here are my partners, Bill Hackett and young Pete Stevens. We've been tracking Crane's gang for 2 months. Clara stepped forward, surprising herself with her own boldness. If you're really lawman, what was the name of the wagon master on the Patterson expedition? Silence stretched between the cabin and the 3 men outside. Clara waited, knowing that any real investigator would have learned this basic information. Samuel Patterson himself, came the eventual reply. Man's own expedition, named after his family. Clara's shoulders sagged with relief. It was true. Samuel Patterson had been leading his own wagon train west, bringing his wife and 2 young sons to start fresh in Colorado territory. The fact that these men knew his name suggested they might indeed be legitimate. "The woman you're looking for," she called through the door. "What makes you think she's alive?" Found tracks leading away from the massacre site. Someone cut her down from a tree and carried her off. McGraw's the only one lives in this part of the mountains. Grizzly made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "Clara," he said quietly, "if these men are genuine law enforcement, they can provide you with protection. I can't. Escort you safely to Denver, help you testify against Crane's gang. And if they're not what they claim," he looked at her steadily, this woman who'd shown remarkable courage in the face of unimaginable horror, "then at least one of us will live to see morning." Clara understood. If the men outside were outlaws in disguise, Grizzly was prepared to fight and die to protect her. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This gruff, lonely man was willing to sacrifice himself for someone he'd known less than a week. "There's another option," she said suddenly. "We leave. Tonight. You know these mountains better than anyone. In a snowstorm, with you still recovering from what you've been through." Grizzly shook his head. "We'd freeze to death before we made it 5 miles. Then we let them in, together." Grizzly studied her face, seeing something there that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with Sarah all those years ago. Courage, the kind of deep, quiet bravery that couldn't be taught or faked. "McGraw," the voice outside had grown impatient, "we ain't got all night. Either you help us or we come back with a federal warrant and enough men to make this difficult for everyone." "Give me your word," Grizzly called back. "Your word as lawmen, that you mean no harm to the woman or to me." "You got it. We just want to talk." Grizzly moved to the door, his hand on the heavy wooden bar that secured it. He looked back at Clara one last time, memorizing her face, in case these were the last peaceful moments they'd ever share. "Stay behind me," he said quietly. "Whatever happens, stay behind me." He lifted the bar and opened the door to face whatever waited in the Colorado darkness. 3 men stood in the doorway, snow dusting their shoulders and wide-brimmed hats. The leader was lean and weathered, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. His companions flanked him carefully, professional, positioning that spoke of military training. All 3 kept their hands visible, a gesture of peace that Grizzly appreciated, even as he remained ready for treachery. "Tom Brennan," the leader said, extending his hand. "Much obliged for your cooperation, McGraw." Grizzly ignored the offered handshake, his rifle held casually but ready. "Say your piece and ride on. The lady's been through enough." "Ma'am," Brennan tipped his hat to Clara, who remained partially hidden behind Grizzly's imposing frame. "I'm sorry for your losses. We need to hear your account of what happened to the Patterson train." Clara stepped forward slightly, studying the 3 men. Something in their bearing seemed genuine. Tired men doing difficult work, not the wild-eyed killers who'd destroyed her wagon train. "How do I know you're really lawmen?" The youngest of the 3, a boy who couldn't have been more than 19, spoke up. "Because if we weren't, ma'am, we'd have just shot McGraw through the window and taken you." "Pete," Brennan warned sharply. "Sorry, Marshal, but she's got a right to know the truth. Crane's gang doesn't negotiate." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. The boy was right. Real outlaws wouldn't have bothered with conversation. They'd have come with guns blazing. "Come inside," Grizzly said reluctantly, "but keep your weapons holstered." The men entered, stomping snow from their boots and accepting the warmth gratefully. Clara noticed they moved like soldiers, alert, disciplined, respectful of the space they occupied. She found herself relaxing slightly. "Coffee," she offered, surprising herself with the domestic gesture. "That'd be kind, miss." Brennan settled into the chair Grizzly indicated, his partners remaining standing. "Been riding hard for 3 days." As Clara busied herself with the coffee pot, Grizzly retreated to his chest and withdrew something wrapped in oiled cloth. The Congressional Medal of Honor gleamed dully in the firelight. Its ribbon faded, but the gold star still bright. Clara gasped softly. She'd heard stories of such decorations, but had never seen one. "Captain Silas McGraw, 3rd Colorado Cavalry," Grizzly said quietly. "Served under Colonel Chivington until I couldn't stomach his methods anymore." Brennan's entire demeanor shifted. "Sir, I had no idea. My apologies for the informal approach." "Rank doesn't mean much out here," Grizzly replied, wrapping the medal away again. "But I figure you boys deserve to know who you're dealing with." "Yes, sir. Makes more sense now. How you've survived alone in this country for so long." Clara poured coffee into tin cups, her mind reeling. Captain McGraw, a decorated war hero who'd retreated to the wilderness. What had driven a man of honor to such isolation? "Now then," Brennan continued, accepting his coffee gratefully. "Miss Whitmore, we need to know everything you remember about the attack. Every detail might help us track down Crane's gang." Clara settled onto the edge of the bed, gathering her thoughts. "It was October 15th, just before dawn. We'd camped near a creek about 20 miles south of here. Willow Creek, the 2nd. "Man," Hackett said. "We found the site. The guards were killed first. Poor Mr. Patterson tried to organize resistance, but the outlaws had us surrounded before most people even woke up." Clara's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "I was sleeping in the Morrison wagon when the shooting started." "How many attackers?" 15, maybe 16 men. They worked like a military unit. Some held the horses, others looted, a few kept watch for anyone trying to escape." Brennan and his men exchanged glances. This matched reports from other attacks. "Tell us about their leader." Hackett pressed. Clara closed her eyes, remembering. Blackjack Crane. Tall man, probably 6 feet, with a thick black beard. The scar from his ear to his mouth. It looked old, maybe from a knife fight. He wore a gray Confederate officer's coat with the insignia removed. Grizzly looked up sharply. "Confederate officer?" That's what it looked like, and he carried himself like military, straight spine, commanding voice. The other men obeyed him without question. Anything else? He had a distinctive weapon, a Colt Navy revolver with pearl handles, but the barrel was longer than normal, and he wore a ring on his right hand, looked like a military school ring, though I couldn't see the inscription. Brennan scribbled notes in a small leather journal. "You've got a good eye for detail, miss. This information could help us considerably." Young Pete stepped forward nervously. "Ma'am, begging your pardon, but we heard tell you might have seen where. They went after the attack. North," Clara said immediately, "toward the high country. They drove the stolen livestock ahead of them, maybe 30 head of cattle and a dozen horses." "That's a slow-moving herd," Hackett observed. "They'd need water and grass." Grizzly moved to a shelf and withdrew a hand-drawn map, spreading it on the table. His knowledge of the territory was remarkable. Every trail, every water source, every possible route through the mountains was marked in careful detail. "If they went north with livestock, they'd have to use one of 3 passes," he said, pointing to the map. "Devil's Backbone is too narrow. Crow's Nest is possible, but there's been rock slides lately. Most likely route is Deadman's Pass. That leads to the old mining camps," Brennan said thoughtfully. "Abandoned settlements, plenty of shelter, and multiple escape routes if they're discovered." Grizzly traced possible paths with his finger. "Smart choice for a man who knows military strategy." Clara watched the men study the map, feeling both hopeful and apprehensive. These seemed like good men, dedicated to justice. But she'd also grown to trust Grizzly's protective presence, and the thought of leaving his care filled her with unexpected anxiety. "Ma'am," Brennan said, looking up from the map, "we'd like to escort you to Denver. You'll be safe there, and your testimony could help us build a case against Crane's entire operation. When would we leave?" "Soon as this storm passes. Maybe 2-3 days." Clara glanced at Grizzly, who was carefully studying the map without. Meeting her eyes, did he want her to go? Was he eager to return to his solitary life? "I appreciate the offer," she said slowly, "but I'm not sure I'm ready to travel yet. Miss, with respect, every day you stay in this territory is another day Crane's gang might track you down. They know someone survived that wagon train attack. Grizzly finally looked up, his grey eyes unreadable. The lady's been through considerable trauma. Rushing her into more danger might not be wise. Captain McGraw, Brennan said carefully, we understand your concern, but we have resources you don't. Federal authority, communication with other law enforcement agencies, safe houses in Denver. And I have 15 years of keeping myself alive in country where most men don't last 15 days. The tension in the room was palpable. Clara realized these men were arguing over her future as if she weren't present. Gentlemen, she said firmly, I appreciate that you all want to protect me, but perhaps the decision should be mine to make. All eyes turned to her. In the firelight she looked fragile but determined, a woman who'd survived unimaginable horror and emerged with her courage intact. I need time to think, she continued, and I need to know that whatever choice I make, it's based on what's truly best, not just what's most convenient for everyone else. Brennan nodded slowly. That's fair, miss, but understand, every hour you delay gives Crane's gang more time to find you. Then maybe, Clara said, surprising everyone, including herself, it's time to stop running and start fighting back. The four men stared at her in stunned silence. Outside, the wind howled through the peaks, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf answered with its own lonely call. The marshals left before dawn, promising to return within a week with additional men and supplies. Their departure left the cabin feeling strangely empty, as if the walls themselves had grown accustomed to conversation and now mourned its absence. Clara stood at the window, watching their figures disappear into the grey morning light, while Grizzly banked the fire and began preparing for what might be their last peaceful days together. Do you think they were really lawmen? Clara asked, still gazing out at the snow-covered landscape. Their story checked out, and they moved like soldiers. But in this territory, a badge doesn't always mean what it should. Grizzly joined her. At the window, close enough that she could smell the wood smoke and leather that seemed permanently part of him. More importantly, do you trust them? Clara considered this carefully. Trust had become a precious commodity since the wagon train massacre. I think they're good men trying to do difficult work, but I don't feel safe with them the way I do with you. The admission hung between them like morning mist. Grizzly felt something shift in his chest, a warmth he'd thought permanently extinguished. Clara, I know what you're going to say, that you're not the kind of man a woman should depend on, that you're too old, too set in your ways, too dangerous. She turned to face him fully. But you saved my life, Silas McGraw, not just from those outlaws, but from giving up hope entirely. He wanted to touch her face, to trace the curve of her cheek with fingers that had known too much violence. Instead, he stepped back, maintaining the careful distance he'd preserved since finding her. You don't know what you're saying. I've done things... He stopped, the words tangling in his throat like barbed wire. We've all done things we regret. Clara moved closer, bridging the gap he'd created. Tell me about your family. Your real family. Grizzly closed his eyes, and for a moment Clara thought he might refuse. Then slowly, as if each word cost him, physically he began to speak. Sarah was a doctor's daughter from St. Louis. Met her when I was stationed at Jefferson Barracks before the war. She was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Not just her face, but her spirit. Kind to everyone, fearless when it came to helping people. His voice grew softer. Said she fell in love with me because I made her laugh. What happened to her? Cholera epidemic, summer of 1854. Swept through the fort like wildfire. Sarah volunteered to help tend the sick, wouldn't listen when I begged her to stay away. He opened his eyes, staring into the flames. She caught it, and Emma, our daughter, she was barely 2 years old, got sick trying to nurse her mother. Clara felt tears she hadn't expected. How did you survive losing them? I didn't. Not really. Grizzly moved to a shelf and withdrew a small object wrapped in soft cloth. Clara gasped when she saw it, a child's slate board, the kind used for teaching letters and numbers. This was Emma's. Sarah bought it for her, said she was going to be the smartest little girl in Missouri. Clara reached out tentatively, touching the smooth surface. Someone had carved tiny flowers around the edges, a mother's loving decoration for her child's first learning tool. Sarah made me promise, before she died, that I'd keep living. Said she couldn't bear the thought of me giving up. His laugh was bitter. Took me 15 years to understand what she meant. And now, Grizzly looked at Clara, really looked at her, seeing not just the woman he'd rescued, but the teacher she'd planned to become, the courage she'd shown, the kindness she'd offered despite her own trauma. Now I think maybe she was trying to tell me that love doesn't end with death. It just waits until the right person comes along to wake it up again. The confession settled between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. Clara felt her heart racing, not from fear this time, but from something infinitely more dangerous. Silas, I know it's madness. I'm 20 years older than you. I live like a hermit in the middle of nowhere, and half the territory thinks I'm more beast than man. He set Emma's slate carefully back on the shelf. But these past few days, having you here, it's the first time since Sarah died that I felt like I might be more than just a man waiting to die. Clara stepped closer, close enough to see the silver threading through his dark hair, the lines that spoke of hard winters and harder memories. What if I told you I don't want to go to Denver? What if I told you I want to stay here with you? I'd say you're not thinking clearly, that you're confusing gratitude with something else. And I'd say you're wrong. Clara reached up and touched his face, feeling the rough stubble, the warmth of skin that had known too little gentle contact. I'd say that sometimes the heart knows things the mind hasn't figured out yet. Grizzly caught her hand, holding it against his cheek. Clara, you're a teacher. You have dreams, plans for your life. You can't throw all that away for a broken-down old soldier. Who says I'd be throwing anything away? I could teach children here, settler families, ranch hands, learning to read. The territory needs teachers just as much as Denver does. She smiled, and he saw a glimpse of the woman she'd been before tragedy touched her life. Besides, I think you could use some education yourself. When's the last time you read something besides hunting guides and army manuals? Despite everything, Grizzly found himself smiling back. It's been a while. Then it settled. I'll be your teacher, and you can be my protector. Fair trade? Before he could answer, she rose on her tiptoes and kissed him. It was gentle, tentative, nothing like the desperate passion of youth, but something deeper. The careful exploration of two wounded souls finding solace in each other when they broke. Apart, Grizzly rested his forehead against hers. You're sure about this? About staying? I've never been more sure of anything. Clara paused, studying his expression. But there's something I need to tell you first. About why I was really traveling west. Grizzly felt a familiar chill of apprehension. What is it? I wasn't just seeking work as a teacher. I was running away from a marriage my uncle arranged, to a man named Harrison Caldwell. He's wealthy, influential, and, she shuddered, the kind of man who thinks women are property to be owned and controlled. He tried to hurt you, not physically, but he made it clear that once we were married, I'd have no choices left. No teaching, no independence, no voice in my own life. Clara's jaw set with determination. I'd rather face a dozen outlaw gangs than spend one day as Harrison Caldwell's wife. Grizzly absorbed this information, understanding now why she'd been so desperate to reach the freedom of the frontier. Does this Caldwell know where you were heading? He knows I was with the Patterson expedition, but he'd assume I died with the others. He's not the type to come looking for a corpse. And if he finds out you survived? Clara met his eyes steadily. Then I suppose we'll deal with that when it happens. Together. Outside, the storm was intensifying, but inside the cabin, two people had found something worth protecting. As they sat by the fire, Clara reading aloud from one of Grizzly's books while he cleaned his weapons, both felt the strange peace that comes from choosing love over safety, hope over fear. Neither noticed the set of tracks circling the cabin, half filled with snow, but still visible to anyone who knew how to read sign. Someone had been watching them, studying their defenses, learning their routines. The hunt was about to begin. 3 days after the marshal's departure, Grizzly found the tracks. He'd been checking his snares in the early morning light when something caught his eye. Horse prints in a sheltered grove where no horse should have been. The snow had partially filled them, but his trained eye could read the story they told. Someone had sat their mount in those trees for hours, watching his cabin. He followed the trail carefully, noting how the rider had moved in a wide circle, always staying within sight of the cabin but using natural cover to remain hidden. Professional work. This wasn't some curious trapper or lost traveler. This was reconnaissance. When he returned to the cabin, Clara was attempting to prepare breakfast with the limited supplies available. She'd proven surprisingly adaptable to wilderness life, though her cooking skills were still developing. The sight of her moving confidently around his small kitchen filled him with a domestic contentment he'd thought lost forever. "We need to talk," he said quietly, not wanting to alarm her but needing her to understand their situation. Clara looked up from the skillet where bacon was sizzling. "What is it?" "Someone's been watching us, professional-like, staying hidden but close enough to study our routines." She set down the cooking fork, her face paling slightly. "Crane's gang? Could be. Or it could be those marshals keeping an eye on things. Either way, we're not as alone as we thought." Clara absorbed this information with the courage he'd come to expect from her. "What do? We prepare. And if necessary, we leave." Grizzly moved to his weapons cabinet, checking ammunition stores. "There's an old mining settlement about 10 miles north, a place called Redemption Creek. It's been abandoned for years, but the buildings are still solid." "Why would we go there instead of trying to reach Denver?" "Because if it's Crane's gang out there, they'll be watching all the main trails. And if it's those marshals, well, I'm starting to have doubts about their real intentions." Clara frowned. "What kind of doubts?" "Think about it. 3 men claiming to be federal marshals, but they had no papers except a single badge that could have been stolen. They knew details about the wagon train attack, but that information could have come from the outlaws themselves." The possibility sent ice through Clara's veins. "You think they were—" "I think we can't afford to trust anyone right now except each other." Clara turned back to the stove, but her hands were trembling slightly. Grizzly noticed and moved behind her, his large hands covering hers to steady them. "Hey," he said softly, "I'm not going to let anything happen to you. You have my word on that." She leaned back against his solid warmth, drawing strength from his presence. "I know. I trust you completely. It's just, after everything that's happened, the thought that we might have invited danger right into our home. This isn't your fault. I should have been more careful, asked harder questions. We both wanted to believe they were genuine." That help had finally arrived. They stood together in the growing morning light, 2 people who'd found love in the most unlikely circumstances, now facing the possibility that their sanctuary might be compromised. "Tell me about this mining town," Clara said, turning in his arms to face him. "Redemption Creek was a silver mine operation that went bust about 5 years ago. The ore played out, and the company abandoned everything, buildings, equipment, even left some supplies behind. It's defensible terrain with good sight lines and multiple escape routes, and you think we'd be safer there than here. I think if trouble's coming, I'd rather meet it on ground I choose, instead of ground that's been watched and studied." Clara nodded slowly. The logic made sense, even if the thought of leaving this place, their first real home together, filled her with sadness. How long would it take to get there? On foot, in this snow, probably 6 or 7 hours. We'd need to travel light, take only what we absolutely need. "When do we leave?" Grizzly smiled at her matter-of-fact acceptance. No tears, no arguments, just practical questions and quiet courage. "Tonight, after dark. If someone's watching, they'll expect us to move during daylight. They spent the day in careful preparation. Grizzly packed weapons, ammunition, and essential survival gear, while Clara gathered medical supplies, food, and warm clothing. She also carefully wrapped Emma's slate in soft cloth, understanding instinctively that Grizzly would need this connection to his daughter. As evening approached, they shared what might be their last meal in the cabin. The simple fare: beans, bacon and coffee tasted like a feast because they were sharing it. Clara found herself memorizing details: the way firelight played across Grizzly's weathered features, the comfortable silence between them, the sense of belonging she'd never experienced before. "Silas," she said suddenly, "whatever happens, I want you to know these past few days have been the happiest of my life." He reached across the small table and took her hand. "Mine too. I'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone to protect, someone to come home to. You won't have to forget again. We're going to get through this." "Yes, we are." His grip tightened slightly. "But Clara, if something does happen, if we get separated or if I don't make it, don't. Listen to me. If something happens, you head for Denver. Find the territorial governor, tell him everything you know about Crane's gang. Don't try to be a hero." "I said don't." Clara's voice was firm. "We go together, we stay together, we survive together. That's the deal." Grizzly studied her face, seeing the same stubborn determination that had kept her alive through the wagon train massacre. "All right, together." As full darkness settled over the mountains, they made their final preparations. Grizzly cached some supplies in a hidden spot outside the cabin, insurance in case they needed to return quickly. Clara took one last look around the small space that had become home, her eyes lingering on the bed where she'd recovered, the chair where she'd read to him, the window where she'd first seen the vast beauty of the Colorado wilderness. "Ready?" Grizzly asked, shouldering his pack and rifle. "Ready." They slipped out the back door into the frigid mountain night. Snow crunched softly under their boots as they made their way toward the tree line, moving with the careful stealth Grizzly had perfected during his military service. Behind them, the cabin sat dark and empty, a decoy for anyone watching. They'd traveled perhaps a mile when Grizzly suddenly stopped, his hand raised for silence. Clara froze, straining her ears. In the distance, barely audible over the wind, came the sound of breaking glass. Someone had just entered their abandoned cabin. "Move," Grizzly whispered urgently. "Fast and quiet." They increased their pace, following a narrow game trail that wound through dense pine forest. Behind them, a faint orange glow began to show through the trees. Someone had lit a fire in there, a cabin, or set it ablaze. Clara felt tears she refused to shed. Their home, their sanctuary, was gone. But as Grizzly's strong hand found hers in the darkness, she realized that home wasn't a place. It was the person beside you when everything else fell apart. Ahead of them, somewhere in the frozen wilderness, lay Redemption Creek and whatever refuge it might offer. Behind them, danger pursued with patient professional persistence. The real hunt had begun. In the abandoned cabin they'd just left, 3 figures stood around the dying fire. The youngest of them, Pete Stevens, looked disappointed. "They're gone. Been gone for hours by the look of it." Tom Brennan studied the cabin's interior with professional interest. "Smart man, this McGraw. Saw through our story faster than I expected." "What now?" asked Bill Hackett, fingering the badge in his pocket, the badge they'd taken from a reel. "Marshal they'd killed 2 weeks earlier. Now we track them. In this snow, even a cavalry captain can't hide his trail forever." Brennan smiled coldly. "Besides, they can't have gone far. And when we find them, well, Black Jack's going to be very interested in having a conversation with the woman who can identify his whole operation." Outside, the wind carried the scent of smoke and the promise of a deadly game of cat and mouse. Through the Colorado peaks, the journey to Redemption Creek took them through some of the most treacherous terrain in the Colorado Rockies. Grizzly led the way with sure-footed confidence, following trails that existed more in memory than on the ground. Clara struggled behind him, her city-bred endurance tested by the thin air and brutal cold, but she never complained. never asked, to rest. By the time pale dawn light filtered through the pine canopy, they'd climbed nearly 2,000 feet in elevation. Clara's lungs burned with each breath, and ice crystals had formed on her eyelashes, but she pressed on, driven by trust in the man ahead of her, and the knowledge that stopping meant death. "There," Grizzly said finally, pointing through a gap. In the trees, Clara followed his gaze and saw their destination, a collection of weathered wooden buildings clustered around what had once been a bustling mining operation. Even abandoned and partially snow-covered, Redemption Creek retained an air of faded prosperity. The main street was wide enough for freight wagons, lined with substantial buildings that spoke of a community that had expected to last. "It's bigger than I imagined," Clara said, surprised. "At its peak, maybe 300 people lived here. Miners, shopkeepers, families hoping to strike it rich." Grizzly's voice carried a note of sadness. "Dreams die hard in places like this." They approached the settlement cautiously, Grizzly's rifle ready and his eyes scanning for any sign of recent habitation. But the only tracks in the snow belonged to small animals, rabbits, foxes, the occasional deer seeking shelter from the wind. The first building they entered had once been the general store. Shelves lined the walls, mostly empty now, but still, holding a few forgotten items: rusted tools, moth-eaten fabric, bottles of patent medicine with faded labels. Clara picked up a child's wooden toy, a horse carved with obvious care, and felt a pang of empathy for the families who'd abandoned their dreams here. "Look at this," Grizzly called from the back of the store. He'd found a cache of supplies, probably left by the last residents: canned goods, ammunition, mining equipment, even some winter clothing. More importantly, there were several cases of dynamite, carefully stored and still stable after years in the dry mountain air. "The miners left in a hurry," Clara observed, studying the scene. "They expected to come back." Silver played out faster than they hoped. By the time they admitted defeat, most folks had already lost everything. Grizzly examined the dynamite with professional interest. "But their loss might be our salvation." They explored the rest of the settlement methodically. The saloon still had tables and chairs. Though mice had chewed through the felt on the poker table, the hotel retained most of its furniture, including several beds with intact mattresses. Most importantly, they found the church, a small but solid building with a bell tower that would provide an excellent vantage point. "This could work," Grizzly said, standing in the church's main aisle. "Good sightlines, multiple escape routes, and enough buildings to make attackers think twice about a frontal assault." Clara climbed the narrow stairs to the bell tower and gazed out over the surrounding terrain. From this height, she could see for miles in every direction. Any approaching riders would be visible long before they reached the settlement. "It's like a fortress," she called down. "That's the idea." They spent the morning fortifying their position. Grizzly used his military engineering skills to create defensive positions throughout the settlement, while Clara organized supplies and established fallback positions. The work was exhausting, but oddly satisfying. They were taking control of their situation instead of simply reacting to threats. By midday, they'd transformed Redemption Creek from an abandoned ghost town into a defensible stronghold. Grizzly had positioned the dynamite at strategic points around the settlement's perimeter, creating potential choke points and escape routes. Clara had established a medical station in the hotel and cached food and ammunition in multiple locations. "You're a good student," Grizzly observed as they shared a simple meal in the hotel's main room. "I had an excellent teacher," Clara smiled, but her expression grew serious. "Silas. What if they don't come? What if we're hiding from shadows? Then we've spent a few days in an interesting place and learned to work as a team." He reached across the table and touched her hand. "But they'll come. Men like that, whether they're real outlaws or fake marshals, they don't give up easily. And if they do come, then we remind them that some people aren't as helpless as they appear." That afternoon, Clara made a discovery that changed everything. While exploring the hotel's upper floors, she found a room that had obviously belonged to a child, Small furniture, toys scattered on the floor, a slate board propped against the wall. But this slate was different from Emma's simple learning tool. This one was covered with careful writing in a child's hand. "My name is Amy Morrison. If anyone finds this, please tell my mama and papa I tried to be brave. The bad men took me from the root cellar after the lady went away. They said they're taking me to their camp to work for them. I don't want to work for bad men. I want to go home." Clara's hands trembled as she read the message. Amy Morrison, the 6-year-old girl from the wagon train, her most eager student. The child was alive, but in the hands of Crane's gang. She rushed downstairs to find Grizzly checking his weapons. "Silas, look at this." He read the slate board, his expression growing grimmer with each word. "When did she write this? The dust patterns suggest it's been here a while. Maybe weeks." Clara's voice was tight with emotion. "She's alive, but they have her. A 6-year-old child, working for those monsters." Grizzly set down his rifle and pulled Clara into his arms. "I'm sorry. I know you cared about that little girl. We have to help her." "Clara, no, listen to me. That child survived because I hid her and the other children. She's in that situation because of choices I made. I can't just abandon her. Even if we knew where Crane's camp was, even if we could reach it, what could 2 people do against an entire outlaw gang?" Clara pulled away from him, her eyes blazing with determination. "The same thing one teacher did when 15 outlaws attacked a wagon train. Whatever it takes to protect the innocent." Grizzly stared at her, seeing something he recognized from his own military service. The moment when a person stops being a victim and becomes a warrior. "You're serious about this?" "Completely." He was quiet for a long moment, weighing their chances, considering the tactical challenges. Finally, he sighed. "All right, but we do this smart. We gather intelligence, first plan carefully, and we don't move until we know we can succeed." "You'll help me?" "I'll help you, but Clara, if we do this, there's no going back. We'll be declaring war on Blackjack Crane and his entire operation." Clara looked down at the slate board, imagining little Amy Morrison scared and alone in an outlaw camp. "Then it's a war they started the day they decided to hurt children." Outside, the wind began to howl through the abandoned buildings of Redemption Creek, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of approaching horses echoed off the mountain walls. Their enemies were coming, but they would find a fight waiting for them. In the hotel room, Clara carefully wrapped Amy's slate board and placed it with Emma's in their supply pack. 2 little girls, years apart, their innocent messages now driving 2 adults toward a confrontation that would determine whether justice or violence ruled the Colorado wilderness. The bell in the church tower began to sway slightly in the rising wind, its bronze surface catching the afternoon light like a beacon of hope in the gathering storm. The riders appeared just before sunset, dark silhouettes against the snow-covered peaks. Clara spotted them first from the bell tower, counting at least a dozen men moving in disciplined formation through the valley below. They rode like cavalry, maintaining distance and communication. Professional soldiers, not the wild rabble she'd expected. "Grizzly!" she called down urgently. "They're here!" He joined her in the tower, studying the approaching force through his army field glasses. What he saw made his blood run cold. "That's not Crane's gang," he said quietly. "What do you mean?" "Look at how they're moving. Perfect spacing, hand signals, coordinated advance. These men have military training." He handed her the glasses. Real military training. Clara peered through the lenses, watching the riders navigate the treacherous mountain terrain with practiced ease. At their head rode a familiar figure, tall, commanding, wearing a grey Confederate officer's coat. "That's him," she whispered. "That's Blackjack Crane." But as the riders drew closer, Clara noticed something that made her heart stop. The man she'd known as Blackjack Crane was holding something in his raised hand, something that caught the dying sunlight and flashed like a signal. A silver locket. Her silver locket. "No," she breathed, the field glasses slipping from her trembling fingers. "It can't be." Grizzly caught the glasses and focused on the lead rider. The scar was there, running from ear to mouth, just as Clara had described. But there was something else, something in the man's bearing, the way he sat his horse, that nagged at Grizzly's memory. The riders stopped at the edge of the settlement, well within rifle range but making no aggressive moves. The leader dismounted and walked forward alone, his hands clearly visible and empty, except for the locket. "Clara Whitmore!" he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "I know you're in there. I've come to talk." Clara felt the world spinning around her. That voice, older, rougher, but unmistakable, she knew that voice. "Clara," the man continued, "it's me, it's Jacob." The words hit her like a physical blow. Jacob, her brother Jacob, who'd run away from home at 17 after their parents died. Jacob, who'd been presumed dead for over 10 years. "That's impossible," she whispered. "Jacob died. Uncle Robert told me." "Your uncle told you what he wanted you to believe." The voice from below was gentler now, filled with an emotion she remembered from childhood. "Please, Clara, let me explain." Grizzly watched Clara's face cycle through. Shock, disbelief, and dawning horror. "You know this man. He's my brother, my older brother who disappeared when I was 14. Clara's voice was hollow, disconnected. "But that would mean Blackjack Crane, the man who's been terrorizing this territory for 3 years, is your own flesh and blood." The full implications crashed over her like an avalanche. Every story she'd heard about Crane's gang, every innocent life lost, every family destroyed, all of it connected to the brother she'd mourned for half her life. "Clara," Jacob called again, "I have something that belongs to you, something our mother left us." He held up the locket, and even from a distance Clara could see it clearly. The same locket she'd treasured, but this one was different, older, more tarnished. A matching piece to her own. "2 lockets," she said numbly. "Mother had 2 lockets made, one for each of us." Grizzly placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "What do you want to do?" Clara stared down at the man who'd haunted her nightmares for months, trying to reconcile the monster she'd known as Blackjack Crane with the brother she'd loved more than anyone in the world. "I have to talk to him," she said finally. "I have to know why." "Clara, it could be a trap. Even if he is your brother, he's still a murderer, a man who attacks innocent families and kills children." Clara's voice hardened. "I know what he is, but I also need to know how he became that way." They descended from the bell tower together, Grizzly's rifle ready but not aimed. Clara felt as if she were walking through a dream. Everything familiar yet completely wrong, like seeing her childhood home burned to the ground. They emerged from the church to find Jacob waiting in the middle of the settlement's main street. He looked older than his 32 years, weathered by mountain living and marked by violence. The scar that dominated his face was newer than Clara had realized, maybe 2 or 3 years old. But his eyes were still the same warm. Brown she remembered from childhood, filled now with pain and regret. "Hello, little sister," he said softly. "Hello, Jacob." Clara's voice was steady, but Grizzly could see her hands shaking. "Or should I call you Blackjack?" Jacob flinched as if she'd struck him. "I suppose I deserve that." "You deserve worse than that. You deserve to hang for what you've done." "Yes," he said simply, "I do." The admission hung between them like a blade. Clara had expected denials, justifications, anger. She hadn't expected acceptance. "Then why," she asked, the word torn from her throat, "why did you become this?" Jacob was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if memorizing it. "Because I was young and stupid and angry, and I made choices that seemed right at the time. And then I made more choices to cover up the first ones, and more after that, until I couldn't remember who I used to be." "The wagon train," Clara said. "The Patterson expedition. You killed those people. You killed families with children." "Yes. You hung me from a tree to die." Jacob's composure finally cracked. "I didn't know it was you. God help me, Clara, I didn't know. When my men told me they'd captured a woman from the train, I was busy with other things. I gave orders without looking, without thinking." Tears ran down his scarred cheeks. "If I'd known it was my baby sister, you would have what?" Killed me more gently? I would have died before letting anyone hurt you. Grizzly stepped forward slightly, his presence a reminder that Clara wasn't alone in this confrontation. If that's true, why didn't you look for her after the attack? Why didn't you try to find out what happened to her? Jacob looked at him with something approaching respect. Because I thought she was dead. My men reported that they'd... He stopped, unable to finish. They reported that they'd left me hanging from a tree, Clara said flatly. Yes, and I wanted to die when I heard it. I wanted to put a bullet in my own head rather than live with what I'd done. But you didn't. No, because dying would have been too easy. Too clean. Jacob reached slowly into his coat and withdrew. A folded paper. This is why I'm here, Clara. This is why I had to find you. He held out the paper and Clara recognized it immediately. A letter, written in her own careful handwriting. You wrote this to our mother's grave 3 years ago. Left it there on the anniversary of her death. Jacob's voice was barely above. A whisper. I found it when I went to visit her. That's how I knew you were still alive, still thinking about family. Clara remembered that letter. A moment of weakness and grief when she'd poured her heart out to a gravestone, telling her dead mother about her plans to travel west, her dreams of teaching children, her loneliness. You've been watching me, she said, the pieces falling into place. All this time, you've known where I was. I hired men to keep an eye on you, make sure you were safe. When I learned you'd joined the Patterson expedition, Jacob's face contorted with anguish. I tried to stop it. I sent word to call off the attack, but the message never reached my men in time. Your men, Grizzly interjected, the ones who call themselves marshals. Jacob nodded. Tom Brennan, Bill Hackett, Pete Stevens, they're good men who've made bad choices, just like me. When they realized what had happened, that they'd attacked a train carrying my sister, they volunteered to find you, bring you back safely. By lying to us, by doing whatever it took to keep you alive. Jacob looked directly at Clara. They were supposed to convince you to come with them willingly. When that failed, they were ordered to watch over you from a distance, make sure Crane's other men didn't find you. Clara felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Everything she thought she knew, every assumption she'd made, was proving false. The real Blackjack Crane, she said slowly. Who is he? Jacob touched the scar on his face. A man who died 3 years ago. I killed him in a knife fight when he tried to hurt a woman under my protection. His gang accepted me as their new leader, and I took his name along with his reputation, and became a monster in the process. Yes, Jacob's voice was flat, emotionless. I became exactly what I'd killed. Clara looked at her brother, really looked at him for the first time since this conversation began. She saw the guilt carved into every line of his face, the weight of 3 years' worth of terrible choices. But she also saw something else, the same protective instinct that had made him fight for her when they were children, twisted now by violence and circumstance. What do you want from me, Jacob? I want to make things right. I want to help you. Get safely to Denver, and then I want to turn myself in to the territorial authorities. And your men? They'll follow my lead. We're all tired of running, tired of being the kind of men our mothers would be ashamed of. Grizzly stepped closer. To Clara, his voice low. You don't have to decide anything right now. This could still be an elaborate trap. Clara nodded, but her eyes never left her brother's face. Jacob, there's something you need to know about the children from the wagon train. What about them? Some of them survived. I hid them before the attack. But your men took at least one of them, a little girl named Amy Morrison. Jacob's face went white. That's impossible. I gave explicit orders. No children were to be harmed or taken. Then someone in your organization isn't following your orders. Jacob turned to one of his men, Tom Brennan, Clara realized, and spoke in urgent, low tones. Brennan's expression grew increasingly grim as he listened. Clara, Jacob said, turning back to her with obvious distress. If what you're saying is true, then I have men acting outside my authority, men who've forgotten the few lines I tried to maintain. Can you find her? Can you get her back? I can try, but it means going back to the main camp, confronting men who might not accept my authority anymore. Jacob paused, studying Clara's face. It means asking you to trust me one more time. Clara felt Grizzly's presence beside her, solid and reassuring. She thought about little Amy Morrison, alone and frightened in an outlaw camp. She thought about the choices that had led to this moment, her decision to hide the children, Jacob's decision to become an outlaw, the cascade of consequences that had brought them all to this abandoned mining town. "If I help you," she said slowly, "if I trust you enough to help rescue Amy, what guarantee do I have that you won't just disappear again, that you'll keep your word about surrendering to the law?" Jacob reached into his coat again and withdrew something that made Clara gasp. A small wooden horse, carved with obvious care and painted in bright colors. The same toy she'd seen in the general store, but this one was different. This one was the toy their father had made for Jacob's 8th birthday. "I've carried this with me every day for 15 years, he said quietly. "It's the only thing I have left of the boy I used to be. The boy you remember." He held it out to her. "I'm giving it to you as my bond. When I've helped you rescue that little girl and delivered you safely to Denver. When I've turned myself in to face justice. Only then do you give it back to me." Clara took the wooden horse with trembling fingers, feeling the weight of childhood memories and adult responsibilities. "All right," she said finally, "but we do this together, all of us. And if you're lying to me, if this is some elaborate trick, then Grizzly McGraw will put a bullet in my head, and I'll deserve it." Jacob looked at the mountain man with obvious respect. "I know your reputation, Captain. I trust you to protect my sister, even from me if necessary." As the sun disappeared behind the peaks and darkness settled over Redemption Creek, 3 unlikely allies began planning a rescue mission that would either redeem a family or destroy what was left of it. The ghost town that had witnessed the death of so many dreams was about to become the birthplace of either salvation or tragedy. In the distance, a child's voice seemed to echo on the wind. Amy Morrison, calling for help that might finally be coming. The night that followed brought little rest for any of them. Clara sat by the hotel window, staring out at the shadowy figures of Jacob's men as they made camp in the settlement's abandoned buildings. The wooden horse her brother had given her felt warm in her hands, a tangible connection to memories she'd thought buried forever. "Can't sleep?" Grizzly asked softly, settling into the chair beside her. "I keep thinking about Amy, about what she must be going through." Clara turned the wooden horse over in her fingers, feeling the careful craftsmanship their father had put into every curve and line. "When Jacob and I were children, he was always protecting me from bullies, from Uncle Robert's temper, from anyone who tried to hurt me. And now I have to protect a child from him, from what he's become." She looked up at Grizzly, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "How do you reconcile that? How do you love someone and fight them at the same time?" Grizzly was quiet for a moment, remembering his own painful choices during the war. "Sometimes love means holding people accountable for their actions, even when it breaks your heart. He wants to surrender himself to the law. Says he's tired of being the man he's become. Do you believe him?" Clara considered this carefully. "I believe he regrets what he's done. I believe he loves me and wants to make amends, but I also know that men can convince themselves of almost anything when the alternative is facing the truth about their choices. So what do? We help him rescue Amy, because that little girl doesn't deserve to suffer for adult sins. And then," Clara's voice hardened with resolve, "then we make sure justice is served, whatever that looks like." Outside, Jacob sat by his own fire, surrounded by men who'd followed him through 3 years of increasingly violent crime. Tom Brennan, his second-in-command, was studying a hand-drawn map of their main camp. "The men won't like this," Brennan said quietly. "Especially Miller and his crew. They've gotten comfortable with the way things are. Then they'll have to adjust." Jacob's voice carried the authority that had kept this disparate group together for so long. "We're going to get that little girl out, and then we're done with this life. And if Mueller refuses, if he decides to make a stand?" Jacob touched the Colt at his hip, the weapon that had ended Blackjack Crane's original reign of terror. "Then he'll learn why I'm the one wearing this name." Pete Stevens, the youngest of the group, looked up from cleaning his rifle. "Boss, what if the girl doesn't want to come with us? What if she's too scared?" "Then we'll have to convince her that we're the good men we used to be, not the outlaws we became." Jacob stared into the flames, seeing faces of all the innocents who died because of his choices. "And if we can't do that, if we can't save one frightened child, then we don't deserve redemption anyway." Inside the hotel, Clara had fallen into an uneasy sleep. She dreamed of the wagon train, but this time Jacob was there as her brother, not as Blackjack Crane. In the dream, he helped her hide the children, fought off the attackers, died protecting the innocent instead of destroying them. She woke to find Grizzly gently shaking her shoulder. "Dawn's coming. Your brother wants to talk strategy." They gathered in the hotel's main room, Clara, Grizzly, Jacob and his 3 men. The atmosphere was tense but focused, like soldiers preparing for a difficult mission. "The main camp is in Devil's Canyon, about 15 miles northeast of here," Jacob began, spreading his map on the table. "It's a natural fortress, high walls, one way in and out, fresh water from a mountain spring." "How many men?" Grizzly asked, studying the terrain with a tactical eye. 12, including Muller and his crew, but only 6 of them will follow my orders without question. And the other 6? They follow Dirk Mueller. He's been pushing for more violent raids, taking risks I wouldn't approve. If he's the one who took the Morrison girl, Jacob's jaw tightened, then he's been operating outside my authority for some time. Clara leaned forward. Where would they keep a child in a place like that? Probably one of the storage caves. Dry, relatively warm, easy to guard. Jacob met her eyes steadily. "Clara, I need you to understand. If Muller's gone rogue, if he's decided to challenge my leadership, this could turn into a shooting war. Then we make sure we're ready for one." Clara's voice was calm, determined. "What's the plan?" Jacob outlined his strategy with the precision of a military officer. They would approach the canyon at dawn, when most of the men would be sleeping off the previous night's drinking. Jacob would enter alone first, ostensibly to check on camp security, but really to locate Amy and assess Muller's position. "If everything goes smoothly," he explained, "I'll signal you to approach. We'll collect the girl and leave quietly." "And if it doesn't go smoothly," Grizzly asked, "then you'll hear gunfire and you'll know we're in trouble." Clara studied the map, noting the canyon's defensive advantages and weaknesses. "There's no back way out of this place. None. That's what makes it such a good hideout, but also what makes it a trap if things go wrong. Then we need to be prepared for the worst." Clara looked around the table at these men who'd agreed to help her. "If we're walking into a potential battle, everyone should know exactly what they're fighting for." She reached into her pack and withdrew Amy's slate board, setting it carefully on the table where everyone could see the child's desperate message. "This is why we're doing this," she said simply. "Not for redemption, not for family loyalty, not for any abstract idea of justice. For a 6-year-old girl who's scared and alone and counting on adults to do the right thing." The men around the table stared at the slate board in silence. Pete Stevens, barely out of childhood himself, wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "She's got good handwriting for such a little thing," he said softly. "She was my best student," Clara replied. "Eager to learn, always asking questions. The kind of child who makes teaching worthwhile." Jacob picked up the slate board, studying the careful letters. "I remember when you were this age, Clara. You used to write me messages, leave them on my pillow when I came home from work. I remember. You always signed them your loving sister, even when you were angry with me, even when I disappointed you somehow." Jacob set the slate down gently. "I haven't been anyone's loving brother in a very long time." "Then maybe it's time to remember how." They spent the remaining hours before dawn in careful preparation. Weapons were cleaned and loaded, escape routes planned, contingencies discussed. Clara insisted on coming along, despite the men's protests, arguing that Amy would be more likely to trust a familiar face than a group of armed strangers. Besides, she added with a slight smile, someone needs to keep you boys honest. As the first grey light of morning began to filter through the hotel windows, Clara made a final check of her gear. She'd traded her dress for practical men's clothing, borrowed from the mining camp supplies, and Grizzly had given her one of his spare revolvers, along with basic instruction in its use. "I'm not much of a marksman," she admitted, fumbling slightly with the weapon. "Point it at what you want to hit and pull the trigger," Grizzly said. "At close range, that's usually enough. Hopefully it won't come to that." Hopefully. But Grizzly's expression suggested he wasn't counting on hope alone. Jacob approached them as they made final preparations. In the growing light, the family resemblance between him and Clara was unmistakable. The same determined jawline, the same steady gaze, the same stubborn courage that had carried them both through impossible circumstances. "Clara," he said quietly, "if something happens to me in there, nothing's going to happen to you. But if it does, I want you to know. Everything I've done these past 3 years, every terrible choice I've made, the one thing that kept me human was knowing you were out there somewhere, living a good life, being the kind of person our parents raised us to be." Clara felt tears threatening and blinked them back. "Jacob, let me finish. You saved me, little sister. Not from my crimes, those are mine to answer for, but you saved me from becoming a complete monster. Just knowing you existed, knowing there was still good in the world that shared my blood. It mattered." "Then prove it," Clara said firmly. "Help me save that little girl, and then help yourself by facing what you've done with courage instead of running away." Jacob nodded, understanding passing between them like it had when they were children sharing secrets. "Time to go," Grizzly announced, shouldering his rifle. They rode out of Redemption Creek as the sun crested the eastern peaks, 5 unlikely allies united by a single purpose. Behind them, the abandoned mining town settled back into silence, its empty buildings holding secrets of dreams deferred and second chances embraced. Ahead lay Devil's Canyon and whatever confrontation awaited them there. As they rode through the crisp mountain air, Clara clutched Amy's slate board against her chest and whispered a prayer, not for her own safety, but for the courage to do whatever was necessary to bring one frightened child home. The wooden horse Jacob had given her seemed to pulse with warmth in her pocket, a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, family bonds could survive, and love could find a way to redemption. Devil's Canyon lived up to its ominous name. The narrow entrance between towering red rock walls would barely accommodate 2 riders abreast, and the path wound treacherously upward for nearly a quarter-mile before opening into the hidden valley beyond. Clara could see why Jacob had chosen this place. It was virtually impregnable to direct assault, but that same defensive strength made it a perfect trap. They dismounted a half-mile from the canyon entrance, concealing their horses in a grove of scrub pine. Jacob checked his weapons one final time, then turned to address the group. "Remember, I go in alone first. Give me 30 minutes to assess the situation and locate the girl. If you don't hear from me by then, we come looking," Clara finished. "Firmly. You get out of here and ride for Denver," Jacob corrected. "Don't throw away your lives for mine." "We're not leaving without Amy," Clara said, her voice brooking no argument. Jacob studied his sister's determined face and recognized the stubborn courage that had defined their family for generations. "All right, but if shooting starts, you stay behind cover and let the men handle it. I'll do what needs to be done." Grizzly drew his cavalry saber from its sheath, the polished steel gleaming in the morning sunlight. The weapon was perfectly balanced, its blade bearing the nicks and scratches of hard use during the war. Clara had never seen him carry it before, but somehow the sight of it in his hands transformed him from mountain hermit back into the decorated officer he'd once been. "What's that for?" she asked. Old habits, Grizzly replied quietly. Some fights require personal weapons. Clara pressed Amy closer against her body, feeling the child tremble with fear. They were trapped halfway up the ravine, exposed and vulnerable, with Muller's rifle trained on them from below. "Let the child go," Clara called down, keeping her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "Your fight is with Jacob, not with an innocent little girl." Muller's laugh was ugly, devoid of any human warmth. "Innocent? She's been useful enough these past weeks, cooking, cleaning, keeping us entertained with her crying." His smile grew more predatory. "Besides, little girls grow up to be witnesses. Can't have that." Amy whimpered against Clara's neck, and Clara felt a surge of protective fury, unlike anything she'd ever experienced. This man had terrorized a 6-year-old child, had treated her like property, had planned to kill her to protect his own crimes. "You're a monster," she said, surprised by the steel in her own voice. "Maybe, but I'm a monster who's about to be very rich." Muller shifted his rifle's aim slightly. "You see, there's been a development you don't know about. Your uncle, Robert Whitmore. He's put up a considerable reward for your safe return. Seems he's been looking for you since the wagon train massacre." Clara felt ice in her veins. "My uncle is in St. Louis. He doesn't even know I'm alive." "Oh, he knows, and he's very eager to have you back. Something about a marriage contract that needs fulfilling." Muller's grin widened. "Man named Harrison Caldwell is paying a fortune to get his runaway bride returned to him." The pieces fell into place with horrible clarity. Uncle Robert had sold her to Harrison Caldwell before she'd even left St. Louis. The arranged marriage hadn't been cancelled by her departure. It had been the reason for tracking her down. "So here's what's going to happen," Muller continued. "You and the brat are coming down from there. We're going to have a little chat with your brother about changing leadership arrangements, and then you're taking a trip back east to meet your husband. And if I refuse, then I shoot the kid first and drag your corpse back to collect the reward, dead or alive, the contract specified." Amy lifted her head from Clara's shoulder, her young face pale but determined. "Miss Clara," she whispered, "the bad man is lying." "What do you mean, sweetheart? He's almost out of bullets. I heard him talking to the other men yesterday. They're running low on everything because the supply wagon didn't come." Clara looked down at Muller with new eyes, noting details she'd missed before. His rifle was an older model, and his gun belt carried only a few remaining cartridges. More importantly, his hands showed the slight tremor of a man who'd been drinking heavily, not the steady grip of a professional gunman. "You heard the child?" Clara called down, testing her theory. "How many shots do you have left, Muller?" The outlaw's confident expression flickered slightly. "Enough to kill you both twice over." "I don't think so. I think you're bluffing. You want to bet a little girl's life on that?" Clara made a decision that would have terrified her weeks ago, but now felt like the only possible choice. "Amy, hold on tight and close your eyes." She drew Grizzly's revolver with her free hand, knowing she had one chance to end this standoff. Muller was 15 feet below them, partially obscured by shadows, but she could see enough of his torso to aim for. "Center mass." "Don't be stupid, lady. You're a school teacher, not a gunfighter." "You're right," Clara said calmly. "I'm a school teacher, and the first rule of teaching is protecting your students." She pulled the trigger. The revolver's recoil nearly knocked her off the narrow ledge, and the sound was deafening in the confined space. But her shot found its mark. Muller staggered backward, clutching his shoulder, his rifle clattering to the cave floor. "You shot me," he gasped, genuine surprise in his voice. "The next one goes between your eyes," Clara said, amazed at her. "Own steadiness. Drop your gun belt and back away from the rifle." Muller hesitated, perhaps calculating whether a wounded schoolteacher could make good on her threat. The calculation ended when Grizzly's voice echoed from the cave entrance behind. "Him. I do what the lady says, Muller. She's got better aim than most cavalry troopers I've known." Muller spun around to find Grizzly blocking the cave entrance, his cavalry saber in one hand and his rifle in the other. The mountain man's face was grim, his grey eyes holding the promise of violence. "Captain McGraw," Muller said, trying to project confidence despite his bleeding shoulder. "Fancy meeting you here. Drop the gun belt, Muller. This is your only warning. You know, I always wondered about you, living alone in the mountains, avoiding civilization. What were you running from?" "Nothing you'd understand." Grizzly stepped into the cave, his movements fluid and dangerous. "Now drop the belt. I think you were running from the same thing we all are. The knowledge that you're not as good a man as you pretend to be." Muller's hand drifted toward his holstered pistol. "How many innocents did you kill in the war, Captain? How many homes did you burn? How many—" The conversation ended when Grizzly's saber took Muller's head from his shoulders in one clean stroke. The outlaw's body collapsed to the cave floor, and sudden silence filled the space. "Miss Clara," Amy called down, "are you and the soldier man all right?" "We're fine, sweetheart," Clara replied, her voice shaking slightly as the adrenaline began to fade. "We're coming down." The descent was easier than the climb had been, and soon Clara was standing in the cave, with Amy still clinging to her neck. Grizzly cleaned his blade on Muller's shirt before sheathing it, his movements mechanical and efficient. "Is he dead?" Amy asked, peering at Muller's body with the morbid curiosity of childhood. "Yes," Clara said simply. "He can't hurt anyone anymore." "Good," Amy said with startling vehemence. "He was a very bad man." The gunfire outside had stopped, replaced by voices calling back and forth across the valley. Clara could hear Jacob shouting, "Orders," Tom Brennan responding, the general sounds of men trying to establish control over a chaotic situation. "Sounds like your brother survived," Grizzly observed. "And his men? We'll find out." They emerged from the cave to find the valley transformed. Merla's supporters lay dead among the rocks. Their brief rebellion ended before it could truly begin. Jacob sat propped against the overturned wagon, his shirt torn and bloody, but his eyes alert and alive. "Clara," he called out when he saw her. "Thank God you're safe." She approached him carefully, Amy still in her arms, studying the brother she'd thought she'd lost forever. "How badly are you hurt?" "Bullet grazed my shoulder. Nothing that won't heal." Jacob's attention shifted to Amy, and his expression softened, with what looked like genuine remorse. "Hello, little one. I'm very sorry for what my men put you through." Amy studied him with the solemn intensity that seemed to characterize all her interactions with adults now. "Are you the leader of the bad men?" "Yes," Jacob said simply. "I am." "Are you going to let Miss Clara take me home now?" "Yes, I am. And I'm going to make sure no one ever hurts you again." Amy nodded, as if this was exactly what she'd expected to hear. "Then I think you might not be as bad as the other men." Jacob's eyes filled with tears he tried to hide. "Thank you, sweetheart. That means more than you know." Tom Brennan approached them, his rifle slung across his shoulder and a grim expression on his weathered face. "Boss, we need to talk. Muller's dead and his men with him, but we've got other problems." "What kind of problems?" "Riders coming up. The canyon. Maybe a dozen men moving fast and armed heavy." Clara felt her blood turn to ice. "Uncle Robert's men. More likely federal marshals," Jacob said grimly. "Real ones this time. Someone must have reported the gunfire." Grizzly moved to the valley's edge and studied the approaching riders through his field glasses. "They're flying a territorial flag. Official business. Then it's over," Jacob said quietly, "which is probably for the best." Clara looked around the valley, at the dead outlaws, at the evidence of years of criminal activity, at her wounded brother who'd chosen to help rescue a child instead of escaping when he had the chance. "Jacob," she said slowly, "what you said about surrendering yourself to the law, did you mean it? Every word? Then here's your chance." The sound of approaching horses grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls like approaching thunder. Whatever happened next, Clara knew that this moment, standing in an outlaw camp with a rescued child in her arms and her brother wounded but alive beside her, represented the end of one chapter of their lives and the beginning of another. Amy lifted her head from Clara's shoulder and pointed toward the canyon entrance. "Miss Clara, are those the good men coming to help us?" Clara looked at the approaching riders, then at Jacob, who was already struggling to his feet despite his wound, then at Grizzly, who stood ready to face whatever came next. "Yes, sweetheart," she said finally, "I think they are." 6 months later, Clara stood at the altar of Denver's First Presbyterian Church, sunlight streaming through stained glass windows to paint rainbow patterns on her simple white dress. The church was small, but filled with people who'd become family, survivors from other wagon trains, fellow teachers from the school she'd established, territorial officials who'd come to respect her courage during the trials that followed Devils. Canyon Amy Morrison sat in the front pew, her hair neatly braided and wearing a new blue dress that Clara had sewn for her. The little girl had grown taller and healthier in the months since her rescue, though she still sometimes woke from nightmares. She lived with Clara now, a legal adoption arranged through the territorial court after it became clear that all her blood relatives had perished in the wagon train massacre. "You look beautiful, Miss Clara," Amy whispered as Clara passed her pew. "Thank you, sweetheart. Are you ready to be my maid of honor?" Amy nodded solemnly, clutching the small bouquet of wildflowers Clara had gathered for her that morning. "I've been practicing walking slowly, just like you taught me." At the altar, Grizzly waited in his best clothes, a new black suit that replaced his usual buckskins, though Clara had noticed he still wore his cavalry boots beneath the pressed trousers. His hair was neatly trimmed, his beard shaped, but his grey eyes held the same steady warmth that had first made her feel safe in his mountain cabin. The ceremony was simple, conducted by Reverend Matthews in language that spoke of partnership and mutual respect, rather than traditional promises of obedience. When Grizzly slipped the gold ring onto Clara's finger, a ring forged from the melted remains of her mother's locket and his congressional medal, she felt the weight of both their pasts and the promise of their shared future. "You may kiss your bride," Reverend Matthews announced with a smile. Grizzly's kiss was gentle, respectful, conscious of their audience, but sincere in its emotion. When they parted, Clara saw tears in his eyes that matched her own. "Mrs. McGraw," he said softly. "Captain McGraw," she replied, using the title that had been restored to him, along with his army pension, after his role in breaking up Crane's gang became known. The reception was held in the church hall, a modest affair with simple food and local musicians. Clara danced with her new husband, while Amy clapped along to the music, her laughter a sound that never failed to lift Clara's spirits. "Any regrets?" Grizzly asked as they swayed to a waltz played on fiddle and accordion. "Only that. It took us so long to find each other. And your teaching, the school." Clara glanced toward the corner, where several of her students, children of miners, ranchers, and townspeople, were playing a quiet game under Amy's supervision. "The school will be here when we get back from our honeymoon. Denver needs teachers, and these mountains need someone to help children learn that there's a world beyond survival." "About that honeymoon, the cabin in Redemption Creek," Clara smiled. "I can't think of anywhere I'd rather spend our first weeks as husband and wife." They'd rebuilt the abandoned mining town together over the past months, transforming it from a ghost town into a small but thriving community. Families seeking fresh starts had begun settling there, drawn by the promise of good land and the protection of the famous Captain McGraw and his remarkable wife. As the evening progressed, Clara found herself stepping outside for air and reflection. The mountains stretched away in all directions, painted purple by the setting sun, beautiful and dangerous and filled with possibility. "Quite a journey from that first night in my cabin," Grizzly said, joining her on the church steps. "I was thinking the same thing." Clara leaned against his solid warmth, marveling at how natural it felt to belong to someone again. "Do you think we'll be happy, Silas? Really happy?" "I think happiness is something you build day by day, choice by choice, like a cabin or a school or a family." He gestured toward the church behind them, where Amy was regaling the adults with a detailed explanation of her latest reading lesson. We've got good materials to work with. A rider appeared at the far end of Denver's main street, moving slowly through the evening shadows. Clara recognized him immediately. Tom Brennan, dressed now in the uniform of a territorial deputy marshal. He'd accepted the governor's offer of legitimate law enforcement work, along with Bill Hackett and Pete Stevens. All three had testified. At Jacob's trial, their cooperation helping to ensure that justice was tempered with mercy. Mrs. McGraw, Brennan tipped his hat as he dismounted. "Captain, sorry to interrupt your celebration, but I have news I thought you'd want to hear." "What kind of news?" Clara asked, though something in his expression suggested it wasn't entirely bad. "Your brother's been granted early release from the territorial prison. Exemplary behavior, cooperation with ongoing investigations, and the fact that he saved 2 children during the Denver bank robbery last month." Brennan smiled slightly. "Governor wants to offer him a job as a federal marshal, if he's interested." Clara felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief, joy, concern, and something that might have been pride. Jacob had spent 6 months in territorial prison, a sentence that could have been much harsher if not for his cooperation and his role in rescuing Amy. But she'd worried about him, wondered if imprisonment would break the spirit that had led him to redemption. "Where is he now?" she asked. "On his way here, actually. Should arrive tomorrow morning." Brennan's expression grew more serious. "There's something else, though. Your uncle and that Caldwell fellow, they're not giving up. They've filed papers claiming you were kidnapped, demanding federal intervention. Let them file all the papers they want," Grizzly said firmly. "Clara's a married woman now, a territorial citizen in good standing. No court in Colorado is going to force her back into an unwanted marriage. That's what the governor thinks too, but they've got money and influence back east, and they're not above using both." Clara considered this information, feeling the familiar surge of determination that had carried her through so many challenges. "Then we'll face that problem when it comes. I've learned that running away only works for so long." Amy appeared in the church doorway, her small face concerned. Mrs. McGraw, is everything all right?" "Everything's fine, sweetheart. Deputy Brennan was just telling us that Uncle Jacob might be coming to visit soon." "The good uncle or the bad uncle?" Amy asked with the directness of childhood. Clara laughed, realizing that Amy had unconsciously identified the central question of Jacob's redemption. "The good uncle, I think. The one who helped save you. Then that's all right. Good uncles are welcome." As Brennan mounted his horse and rode away into the gathering darkness, Clara felt Grizzly's arm tighten around her waist. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: Jacob's uncertain future, the continued threat from her past, the day-to-day work of building a life in an unforgiving land. But tonight was for celebration, for the warmth of family and community, for the promise that love could survive even the worst circumstances. "Ready to go back inside, Mrs. McGraw?" Grizzly asked. In a moment, Clara looked up at the first stars appearing in the darkening sky, thinking of all the people who'd shaped her journey: her parents, Sarah and Emma McGraw, the families from the wagon train, little Amy Morrison with her brave heart and careful handwriting. From inside the church came the sound of laughter and music, the voices of people who'd found reasons to hope, despite living in a land where hope was often in short supply. Clara thought about the slate board she'd collected, Emma's simple learning tool, Amy's desperate message, the blank slates waiting in her new schoolroom for children who would learn that education was the foundation of freedom. "Silas," she said quietly, "do you remember what you told me that first night? About helping one person being the only way to forgive yourself for all the ones you couldn't help?" "I remember. I think you were wrong about something." Grizzly looked down at her, concerned. "What's that?" "I don't think it's about forgiveness. I think it's about understanding that every person you save, every kindness you show, every moment of courage you display, it all adds up. It becomes who you are, not just what you've done." "And who are we, Clara McGraw?" She smiled. hearing the name that would define her future, feeling the solid presence of the man who'd become her anchor in a world of uncertainty. We're teachers, protectors, second chances made flesh. We're proof that people can change, that love can grow in the most unlikely places, that sometimes the best families are the ones you choose rather than the ones you're born into. Amy appeared beside them again, having apparently decided that the adults were taking too long with their private conversation. "Are you coming back in? Mrs. Patterson wants to show everyone how to do a square dance, and she says we need more grown-ups to make the sets even." Clara laughed, taking Amy's small hand in one of hers and Grizzly's larger one in the other. "We're coming, sweetheart. We're definitely coming." As they walked back into the warm glow of the church hall, Clara caught a glimpse of their reflection. In the window glass, a family bound not by blood but by choice, commitment, and the shared understanding that love was something you fought for, not something that simply happened. The mountains that surrounded Denver would always be beautiful and dangerous, filled with both promise and peril. There would be more challenges ahead. Jacob's uncertain redemption, the threats from her past, the endless work of building civilization in the wilderness. But Clara McGraw faced those challenges with the confidence of a woman who'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to do what was right despite being afraid. In the schoolhouse that bore her name, slate boards waited for the next generation of children who would learn to read and write, to think and dream, to believe that education could unlock doors to futures their parents had never imagined. And in a small cabin on the outskirts of town, 2 wedding rings sat side by side on a simple wooden table. Circles of gold forged from the remnants of loss and the promise of love. Symbols of the truth that sometimes the most beautiful endings grow from the most unlikely beginnings. The story of the mountain man who found a woman hanging from a tree had become the story of 2 people who discovered that salvation comes not from running away from the past, but from having the courage to build something better from its ashes. In the Colorado Territory of 1848, where danger lurked behind every peak and hope was a luxury few could afford, Clara and Silas McGraw had chosen love over fear, community over isolation, and the difficult work of redemption over the easier path of despair. And in the end, that choice made all the difference.